Well, good evening and welcome to the first event of the new year at the Marin County Law Library. Tonight we are very, very pleased to be welcoming not only the current foreperson of the Marin County Civil Grand Jury, but her compatriot from last year. Before we get into tonight's event, I'd like to take a moment to thank our law librarian, Stephen Richards, for working late tonight and helping host this event. Stephen, if you have not had occasion to meet, is our law librarian. He and his staff keep the law library open almost 40 hours a week. For those of you with long-standing knowledge, there was a period of time when the law library was closed. We are pleased that we continue to progress in reopening all facets of it, and that would include lawyers in the library. The last thing that I would like to point out before we begin tonight's program is our good fortune to be making an addition in the coming months to the services we provide to the self-represented here in Marin County. We are adding an appellate component for the self-represented who wishes to appeal a civil action in court and is looking for some guidance and information. That will be an element that will be added to our Lawyers in the Library program starting in February. For those with an interest, please feel free to go back to our YouTube catalog and take a look at the December presentation with attorney Elliot Bean. I will point out that Elliot is a former member of our board and comes back to us inspired to be assisting in developing this program. It would not be happening without the continued assistance and support from the Marin County Bar Association. We are grateful to be in this community. We're grateful to be of service. And tonight, we're extremely grateful to have Pat Shepard and Deborah Haas join us tonight. These folks represent what we call members of the Citizens Watchdog Committee here in Marin. Roughly translated, what we're talking about is the civil grand jury. Be aware that grand juries have existed in California since the original Constitution, 1849 to 1850. In 1879, the Constitution included this provision, and it's now found in Article 1, Section 23. One or more grand juries shall be drawn and summoned at least once a year in each county. Article 1 also states at Section 14 that crimes are prosecuted either by grand jury indictment or by the filing of a set of charges called an information. These are the only constitutional provisions related to the grand jury. The remainder of grand jury law, I believe, is found in state statutes. All of this came about a very long time ago. We have one in each county. There are 58 counties in California. The folks that we have here tonight give us a unique perspective, and it was fully fleshed out for me before we came on when Deborah told me that she was the last grand jury member before COVID came along, and Pat is the person who picked up the ball with the limitations of meeting and how the grand jury could meet with COVID. We have what I would believe a unique pairing tonight. And they're unique not only because of this kind of experience, but because who these folks are. Who they are and what they do is profoundly unique and very valuable in our community. These are individuals who willingly, that should get a chuckle out of someone, and honestly approach this with the idea that they're going to give perhaps a minimum of 25 hours a week to this commitment. They didn't realize that people like Stephen and I would be hounding them and asking them to come and present after hours. But that's where you're lucky, and you get to hear about these remarkable people. Normally, I would start and give an introduction about them, but I'd like us all to consider what it means to be giving to a community on this level, what it is in our lives that might inspire us to do this, and what it is in our lives that might give us the actual opportunity to commit this time to our community. I'd like to introduce Pat Shepard and Deborah Haas and tell them how much we appreciate having them. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Denise. That was very kind of you. So to open this up, we'll give our backgrounds so you can know a little bit more about us. And how the presentation will go is that I will present the first half of it, and then we'll take a pause and see if you have any questions. And then after that, Deborah will present the second half, and then there can be questions at the end. So I've been a resident of Marin County for 45 years. I hail from the New York area, and was married here, raised my son here. He attended schools in Marin. But besides the involvement that I've had, with the schools, many decades ago, my work always took me outside of the county. And so I would read about the Marin County Civil Grand Jury in the paper, and I thought, one day I can get involved in that. But there never was enough time because I was either traveling or I was, up in Sacramento, and I really didn't have the time to commit. My career for the last, well, in the beginning of my career, my husband and I were self-employed in Marin County. And then for the last 30 years, I've worked in healthcare and in various roles in healthcare for a number of large systems. And when I retired, I thought, okay, this is my opportunity to get involved with the grand jury. But I don't know that I fully understood what that meant. I was fortunate in that my year as a juror was Deborah's year as the foreperson, and that was last year. So we have that overlap. And it was such a rewarding experience. I learned so much about the county that I've been living in all of these decades. It actually, instead of getting tired of anything, it just really inspired me to be even more interested in the various topics. We got to meet a lot of interesting people, and I would highly recommend it. This will be my second year this year as the foreperson, and so then after that, I will not be serving anymore. And I have to say that I will miss it, and I will miss the interaction with the other grand jurors. So with that, Deborah, if you want to take a minute to give some of your background.
Sure, thank you, Pat. As Pat mentioned, I was the foreperson of the previous grand jury, and I was a member on the jury the term before that, which began in 2019, which were quite different times. I am an attorney. I also have a background in investment banking. I worked as a permanent clerk for the Federal Court of California, and I've also served as an adjunct law professor in appellate advocacy. About a decade ago, when I kind of slowed down with work and focused more on my family, I was looking for meaningful volunteer work to continue staying engaged with the community and engaged with work that I was interested in. And I have to say, after running so many school galas, I was thrilled to finally find the grand jury. And the first time I applied to the grand jury, I was the very last alternate, which we'll talk about how that happens. And so that was a bit of a disappointment. So I didn't get to serve that year. A few years later, I applied again, and I again was an alternate. But this time I got called up to that jury and served on that term. And then I did my second term as the foreperson. It is a lot of hours, but it's meaningful work. Most people do it for 1 year, and you learn so much about this great county that we live in that I would encourage anyone to give a real consideration into taking a year of your life to do this, because it'll be with you for the rest of your life.
Great, thank you. Let's see if I have there we go. So this evening, we're going to cover these 4 main topics, and that is, what is the civil grand jury? And we've heard a lot about it already, but hopefully I can provide a little bit more information. And what is the job of the civil grand jury? They have these terms, we're watchdog, et cetera, but really, what is the grand jury expected to do, and what are they expected to produce? And how does it work? We've given you a little hint of that, but the parameters by which the grand jury operates are really pretty specific in a lot of ways, and we'll share those with you. And then how you can participate in this important work if you're interested, and we hope that you are. So as Denise mentioned, the Constitution of California requires that every county, and there are 58 counties in California, impanel a civil grand jury each year. And it's an arm of the judicial system, but acts as an entirely independent body. There is a presiding judge that is assigned to provide us with guidance when we need it, but that would be besides really being the final decision maker in terms of who is on the grand jury. He is there for us to consult with, but on a fairly infrequent frequent pace. As Denise mentioned also, it is an independent watchdog. It's an investigative body for Marin governments and makes recommendations for improvements. The scope of which would be really any entity that receives public funds would be most likely part of the really the scope of which we could investigate. There are other states in the nation that do have civil grand juries, but they're not that many. So California is pretty unique in that way. And the grand jury also has subpoena power. So that's something that is, I think, is not used very frequently, but it is sort of a known fact. And I think it helps us gain cooperation, although overall, the level of cooperation that we receive from really all of the entities that we engage with is very, very high. What we're not is a criminal grand jury. So a lot of people think, oh, the grand jury, they're thinking, Perry Mason, but that's not where we go. We are not involved in any kind of criminal recommendations for trials. So you can just erase that from your mind. It is really a civil grand jury and not a criminal grand jury. So who serves on the grand jury? It is, Deborah gave a little bit of an explanation. So we're all citizen volunteers. And so it's not a paid position. It does require a significant amount of time in the very beginning. It's maybe 10 hours. And as investigations heat up and as reports are being written, the demands increase significantly. I would say 20, 25 hours is an average. I would say that there are times when it could be even more than that. And that was one of the reasons I was explaining, although I don't know that I was fully aware of the situation, that I just didn't feel that when I was traveling for work that I could really spend the appropriate amount of time on a volunteer effort like this. There are 19 jurors on each year on each panel. That includes one four-person and one four-person pro tem. So we'll see later that these 19 people theoretically are different every year, but there are generally 1, 2, 3 holdovers based on the judge's discretion, so that there is some continuity from one jury to the next. But the other thing that's very interesting is that the work is very confined to the year of the jury term, which means that the 19 jurors that we have in panel this year, when we finish our work, then the next 19 jurors that come for the next year will start all over again, start from the very beginning. They are not bound by anything that was started or not completed by this year's jury, but instead they can start fresh. The jury's term is for 1 year, and it goes from July 1st through June 30th of every year. So the purpose, the job, is to investigate local government matters of civil concern and interest. And how that's done is through the identification of issues. Now, there's no lack of ideas in terms of issues. Most people come to the jury with lots of ideas or things maybe they were wondering about or were concerned about. There's also the next step after identifying these issues that are of interest to investigate is the investigation itself. So there's an investigation and research on topics. And sometimes, very often this leads to the reports that are published, but sometimes it's determined, well, you know what, there's really no there, or by the time we thought it was interesting, but then we didn't realize that this entity was already had self-identified the problem and was already working on it. And so, what we could contribute with an investigation really wasn't significant enough. Then after the research, there's actually a report writing phase, which can be pretty intense because the research involves all kinds of, online interviews, etc. Then the report is fact-based, and so all of this has to be coalesced. The findings are really based on the facts that are gathered. And then the report includes not only the findings, but recommendations. And the recommendations really are the whole point of really saying, we have found that there is perhaps this issue or opportunity, and here is our recommendation to remedy it. And then those reports get published. So getting back to the issues, so Marin County here, we all know it and love it, and it's considered a very educated, a very wealthy county, but there are only, excuse me, let me see if I'm sorry if I missed, okay. But they're unlike San Francisco, for example, which prior to the pandemic was pushing, close to 1 million people. We have about a quarter of the population. It could be a little different now because of the pandemic, but with San Francisco, for example, you have centralized operations, and so you have a one board of education. You have one fire department, one police department. Well, Marin is very fragmented. There are 11 municipalities plus the county government. There are 30 independently elected sanitary, fire, water, and community service districts. There are 16 school districts, a community college board, and the county office of education. There are special districts. There are districts, for example, SMART, where you have an organization that is in collaboration with another county, but is receiving tax dollars from the county of Marin. And altogether, there are 285 elected public officials in Marin. So in spite of its small size, it is very fragmented and there's a lot going on. So there's a lot to consider. The investigations are identified in a number of different ways. First of all, the only mandated inquiries are to the prisons that are in our jurisdiction. So in Marin County, we have San Quentin, we have the Marin County Jail, and we have the Marin County Juvenile Hall. We don't have to do an investigation on any of those sites, but we do have to make site visits and just observe to see if there are any investigations that would be important or relevant. San Quentin's a little tricky in that it is a state institution. And so that has to be, we have to consider there just what impact does it have on Marin, and you have to be very circumspect about how we would handle something like that. The grand jury, as I mentioned earlier, selects its own topics to investigate. People come with ideas, and the investigations are conducted by securing and reviewing public information, document requests, site business interviews. And then there's also a third way, and that is, a lot of people don't know about this, but online on the Marin County Grand Jury, Civil Grand Jury website, there is actually a form that can be completed by anyone in the community, and it is a request for investigation. And we get many requests for investigation from the public, and they will provide us with their concern and any backup, any information that they have. These are suggestions to the grand jury. The grand jury, when they receive them, has to decide if it's within our scope. Sometimes they are really more on a personal level, and it's not within our scope. But also sometimes the grand jury just doesn't have time for it, because how the process works is we start off, we have to figure out what we want to work on. You get involved with the investigations, then you get involved in the report writing. We have a deadline, which is actually, come April, May, we have to be able to be ready to start publishing reports. And so if we get a request that may have a lot of merit, then it may be that we just can't absorb it into the workload. And this is the one category that we are able to pass along to the next term, the jurors of the next term, to see if it's something that they would like to investigate. But they're not obligated to, because as I said, the work stops June 30th, and then a whole new set of jurors and a whole new set of topics starts the following day, which is July 1st. The reports are based on online research, as I mentioned earlier, document review. Sometimes we'll hear that, oh, there's this report being generated or being developed or whatever, and we're able to generally secure that type of documentation. In-person interviews, this is something that really makes the grand jury so interesting, in that we interview dozens of people, and it's so interesting really to hear their perspectives from kind of the boots on the ground, what it really like to run a particular operation or interact with other parts of the county. There's a rule of two, and what that means is that whenever a grand jury juror interacts with anyone that's part of the investigation, there needs to be two jurors involved. And this way we ensure that there's no confusion about what was said, what the intentions were, etc. And triangulation, meaning that if there's an interesting, what appears to be an interesting fact that we would like to continue investigating, we have to get backup confirmation of that fact. So just one person saying something is not a fact, and they need to be substantiated. Each investigation results in a report, as I said, and includes the findings and recommendations. The reports are written at a committee level, so that most years there are maybe 6 or 7 reports. I think one year in the past there were 18. I have no idea how that jury did that. But the idea is that in order to be functional, the work is broken up into committees, and so jurors get the opportunity really to gravitate to the committee with the topics that they're the most interested in. But at the end of the day, at the end of the term, all of the reports are released under the approval of the entire grand jury. And the reports must be approved by a supermajority of all the jurors. So that's 12 out of 19. I will say, it's not written here, that there are other layers of scrutiny, if you will. The county council will review reports, and before they're ever released, the presiding judge reviews them as well. After the reports are finished, and finally approved, they are submitted to the elected or appointed officials for required responses. And they are required to respond. They have between 60 and 90 days to respond. And we do post all of these reports on the grand jury website, and also whether or not the entity has responded is also posted on the website, and that's for anyone to see. And then finally, besides being posted online and distributed to media outlets for they're distributed to media outlets for publication. So after all of this work, it's so thrilling to see, a report that gets covered in the IJ or other forms of media, because that's really our way of reaching out to the community. There are a number of people who know and go on the website, and they're very familiar with it and keep up to date that way. But having it in the newspaper is really very rewarding. So with that, I'm going to pause and ask if there are any questions before we turn the conversation over to Deborah. Okay. All right. Deborah?
Thank you, Pat. So I'm going to just talk a little more specifically about what the grand jury has done in Marin, and if you are lucky enough to find yourself involved with the grand jury, what that might mean. So as Pat said, the point of the grand jury is to issue these reports to improve local government. The grand jury is required to issue one report. In Marin, it's generally between 6 and 10, but it depends largely on the year and the jury. This slide shows 3 of the reports, the press coverage for 3 of the reports that we wrote this year, or last year. They all came out in late spring, early summer of last year. So on the top, we wrote about how the schools approached the COVID situation. On the bottom left, we wrote a report about Marin Municipal Water District and their long-term planning. And then we also wrote a report about the housing strategy for Greater Marin and the continued lack of sufficient low-income housing. We wrote a few other reports also, but we're always thrilled that the IJ does a nice job, because as Pat mentioned, the reports are very fact-based, very evidence-based, and they're not always the lightest reading. And the only places they go are to the people they're written to, and also on our website. So we're lucky that we have local media that takes a look at it and shares it, amplifies our voice so the community can be involved. In the term 2018-2019, the grand jury wrote a report called The Wildfire Preparedness, a New Approach. And we were thrilled that this report won the award for the best grand jury report throughout California for that year. One of the exciting things about that report was that it recommended that the county establish a wildfire agency and support it with a tax. And that indeed happened. And nobody would say that the grand jury all by itself made that happen. There was work from a lot of agencies and a lot of people. But the grand jury was a very important voice in that conversation because it was impartial, it's well respected, and it was disinterested, a group of disinterested citizens who looked at this with fresh eyes and came with this message. So that was an exciting win. And Pat's reports aren't out yet. They'll be out later this spring. So not kind of a high bar there, Pat, to
I know.
keep on for.
Okay.
All of our reports are available online. It's on the County of Marin website. Civil grand jury has its own section. That's where you would find out more about the grand jury, where you would apply, if you had a topic that you would like the grand jury to investigate, and also where you can read all the reports. So for fiscal year 2021-22 was the term that we finished in the end of middle of summer. And those were the reports that we wrote, and they're all available there. In addition to the reports are the responses, the people that we've written the reports to, whether it's to city councils, whether it's to boards, they have to answer our recommendations and tell us what they think about our recommendations. And those responses are also on there. So that can be some interesting information to see how those reports were responded to. So what are the traits of a successful grand juror? Well, being on a grand jury is not like anything else that you have ever done, because everybody is equal. The foreperson has some administrative power, but nobody has any more of a voice than anyone else. And you've got to get at least 12 people to agree with you to be able to move forward with ideas. And preferably you get more than that, because every idea, every decision needs to be agreed upon by a supermajority of the group. So some of the traits are: 1, you need to work well with others. 2, you need to listen to understand. You need to respect other opinions. This one can be a tricky one in Marin, because one of the neat things about Marin is there's a lot of really interesting people who live here, and there's a lot of really successful people who live here. And the things that brought them success in the other parts of their life may not be traits that bring them success to the grand jury entirely. So you've really got to be ready to respect people who've coming from entirely different walks of life. And that's what the jury is supposed to be. It is supposed to be 19 citizens that represent different experiences in the county. You need to have an open mind. You need to be humble. And then this is really important. You can't come with an axe to grind. And even more than that, you really can't come with your own agenda. If you come onto the jury, lots of people come on and they already have been involved with some activist positions in Marin or other volunteer positions in Marin. That is fine, but you can't bring that to the grand jury. That all needs to get left at the door. And frequently what we recommend, if somebody's really involved in another organization, that they kind of give themselves a year sabbatical from that organization to just focus on this. And then finally, it's fact-based decision-making. The grand jury spends a lot of time sharing their opinions with each other in the grand jury room, but those opinions just can't go into a report. The report is a fact-based report. The findings are a result of the facts. The facts are a result of the investigation. Any recommendations are based on all of that. And any jurors' opinions or all the jurors together opinion is not what the grand jury is meant to do. And any sign of that will be quickly flagged by the people who review it. And more importantly, any sign of that really damages the reputation of the grand jury. In Marin, the grand jury has a really good reputation. And that, one, makes it more fun to be on because you're generally respected. And two, it makes it much more effective because people are inclined to read, even if it's not flattering for them. They're inclined to read and at least give some respect to it. How does the grand jury organize? As Pat mentioned, so it's 19 people. Once a week, those 19 people meet for several hours to do the business of the jury. But most of the work of the jury happens in committees. Committees, maybe 5 or 6 people. And the committees will tackle the individual topics. Each grand jury will have a number of committees, 6 or 7 or 8. Most people will only work on 2. Any more than that is really too much. Some of the past committees have been law and justice, environment and transportation, education, and these others. The name of the committee doesn't really matter. The grand jury can do an investigation into so many different things. And any one of those 258 elected officials, any one of those 30 special districts, any one of those municipalities or counties or subsets of them. So the committees just help the jury work. And these committees also meet once a week, usually for about 2 hours. So as Pat mentioned, the way it works, in the beginning of the jury, you're meeting with everybody once a week, and you're meeting with your committees. When investigations ramp up in the middle of the term, you're meeting more often. You're having interviews more often. You're covering more topics. And then when you get to the writing stage, frequently you need to meet more to do the writing. And then at the end of the year, as the committees wrap up their work, it tails off again. The writing has to be done quite a bit earlier than the term is done because of all the steps that go into publication. So that's generally how it works, is through your committees and then with a once a week meeting with everybody. Training. So no one knows how to be a grand juror. Even if you were a grand juror last year, you don't know how to be a grand juror this year because it's a whole different group of people and a different foreperson. Nobody is expected to bring any knowledge of how to be a grand juror when they come. And really the open mind is better. So we do extensive training. The first week is nonstop training. It can be a fire hose, sometimes we hear. And then there's ongoing training that happens throughout the year, report writing, additional training, both from outside trainers and within, continued tech training. And it is still a learn as you go job. So you do want to come to it with an open mind. You're going to get a lot of training. Everyone's going to get a lot of preparation, and then you are going to learn as you go, and everybody's going to be in that same position. It's very rewarding being a grand juror. It isn't always rewarding during that year. It can be incredibly frustrating. It can be tedious. It can be exhausting. It can also, during that year, be fascinating. Some of the people you get to interview, the people you get to meet, the things that you get to get real inside information. The grand jury is confidential, and it's confidential forever. So the things that you learn, you really have access to confidential information, and you need to keep it confidential forever. But it's really gives you an insight to learn those, how the county works. But it's really rewarding when the work is finally done and you can sit around and look at this group of people that you've come together with, and you have somehow managed to write these reports that lots of people are talking about and might just make a little difference and make the county a little bit better. And it's really a chance for citizens to be involved in civic solutions. So everyone who does it will tell you that it was just a really meaningful work. So why be it? Again, we talked about the rewards. There's a huge satisfaction. There's generally some pride in being a part of it. And it's really, really fun to learn about local government. We often say that being on the grand jury gives you a master's degree in local government. You get to know the people running our communities. And generally in Marin County, we are blessed with some hardworking, smart, dedicated civil servants. And it's pretty neat to really get to know that. There's some amazing field trips. The jail, San Quentin, and juvenile hall are things that you won't ever forget. Some of the other field trips the jury's been on, they've been on SMART train rides. They've toured the Golden Gate Bridge. They've been out and walked around the water district, seen fire operations, gone into the emergency operations center, tour of the civic center, and many other of the fabulous resources that Marin has become available for you to learn about as a grand juror. In order to be a grand juror, you need to be 18 years or older, US citizen, a Marin resident for a year, have some computer skills and some willingness to learn how we work. You have to maintain confidentiality. That's from everybody and it's for life. So reunions among jurors are encouraged and very enjoyable because they're the only people that you get to talk about this shared experience with. And then it really is a 12-month job, minimal absences, and the year goes from July 1st to June 30th. Applications, the deadline's April 22nd, but you can send an application in anytime. The application is not very arduous. It's on the website, and you can fill it in right on the website. You can also print it out and mail in one. It's very much the basic information to see if you meet the requirements to be a grand juror. It is not an in-depth application, employment application by any means. So we've gathered all of these by April 22nd. There's an interview process where former jurors will interview everyone that's applied and also kind of do a group exercise to get a feel for what it's like to work. The judge chooses a final 30. And in June, those 30 names are all put into, they're really put into a bingo ball like this, and they're drawn randomly. And the first 19 names will be jurors, and the next 11 will be alternates. As I mentioned before, twice my name came out as an alternate. And one time I was the 11th alternate, so I did something different that year. But the next time I was the second alternate. And it's very common to go through some alternates, no matter how well people plan. There's always a few people that life gets in the way and they're not able to do this commitment. And so the alternates become very important. And the alternates get to participate in all the training and also some of the field trips. So there are some benefits to being an alternate. At that time, the jury is sworn in and they get to work. This is our contact information, and then let's go to questions. And I do see in the chat how many of the jurors are lawyers. Too many. There is no requirement to be a lawyer. The only reason I think we get a number of lawyers on the jury is because they know about the civil grand jury. So part of Pat and ours job is to get the word out so everybody knows about it. I'm always saying more engineers, fewer lawyers, because engineers pay great attention to detail, and there's a lot of detail work. But there's no requirement, and thinking you know how it's going to work is not really very helpful. So any background is an excellent background.
Let's see, we have some comments here about how rewarding the experience is. How often do the agencies investigated comply with grand jury recommendations? I don't know. It's something we're working on this year in a group called Continuity in terms of looking at the responses from last year, but there hasn't been historically a lot of data collected on it. I would have to say that one of the tricky parts is that we have this, start and stop, start and stop. And so the bridge is a committee called Continuity. And this year we're trying to assess really to quantify the responses. The responses, sometimes the recommendations are big, and we have to be realistic in terms of what we're expecting organizations to do, because there are budgets that are set, there are perhaps approvals that have to be made. And so I really feel like one of the big things that we do is get it out in the public so that there's an awareness there, and we help reset expectations of the community. But I don't have any hard data on this particular question, but we're working on getting more data than we have.
And there's a question here, can an active staff member of a public agency be a juror? Yes, they can. Anyone in an elected office cannot be a juror. Staff members can, but there's a lot of conflict of interest concerns that you would want to talk to during the interview process, want to get that out there and talk about, because there are protocols for conflict of interest for the jury to deal with, but there is no prohibition from a staff member being on the jury.
Right, and to add that, even the conflicts of interest, whether it be someone who is actively working for an organization, there is a recusal process. So if in those situations, for example, suppose you were working for the library, if there were an investigation involving the library, we would expect the person who is working for the library to recuse themselves from that investigation. And that way, the objectivity of the report can be maintained. Let's see. Copy of the presentation, certainly. And I think, Stephen, you were mentioning that this gets put on YouTube.
Yes, the video will be, next week.
Okay. How many applications are typically received each year? So I think this year there were 65 or 75, somewhere in there. If do you recall, Deborah? But I think
it was that sounds about right.
Yeah. So, and part of what Deborah and I are doing as part of also the Marin County Civil Grand Jury Association is to work on our recruitment efforts, because I think this is a gem of an opportunity, and it's not very well understood, or a lot of people aren't aware of it. Is there a criminal grand jury in Marin? I believe that's a no. Do you know more about that, Deborah?
Yeah, so a criminal grand jury is only impaneled when a when the prosecutor's office, the district attorney asks for it because of a particular investigation where a criminal grand jury would be needed. So it isn't a standing grand jury. It would be impaneled if needed. And there is a provision where the civil grand jury could be transitioned into that criminal grand jury. That's a pretty unique when that happens, and I wouldn't come into this counting on that. But there has not been a case with a criminal grand jury in Marin in recent history. There has been in some of our surrounding counties in these past couple of years.
Okay, and then this is the lawyer question. So I think we have fewer lawyers this year than we had last year, but lawyers have some good skills. So definitely usually good writers. Let's see. So I think that's it with the questions.
The staff, Pat, you want to talk about your staff?
The
grand jury staff.
Oh, okay. Staff. So going along with what Deborah was describing about kind of leaving your status or role in life, at the door. We have a part-time person for staff support. I think we get like 40% of her time, but because of the confidentiality, the room is really, there's no access to the room except to the grand jurors. And so everything that happens in that room is supported by the grand jurors. I mean, even from somebody being assigned to bring in the snacks. So it is a pretty self-propelled group of people, and the staff support really is more in providing us with a link, perhaps, to other people that we need for resources, getting budget information and that type of thing. So just think of yourself as the staff.
Yes. And then Pat, there's a question, are the meetings often on Zoom or preferentially in person? Do you want to answer?
Okay. Well, I mean, as Deborah was saying, COVID really, I think the beginning when Deborah was foreperson and I was a juror, that term was actually 15 months and not 12 because of COVID. And I think we started out all on Zoom or on Google Meets and then transitioned to in person, because we follow the public health directives, and we were able to start this year with all in-person meetings. Now, we do have some really nice technology. We operate on Google Meet, so that's part of the computer training sometimes people have to go through. But that allows us to allow people to join the meeting that's in the room remotely. And what we have found this year is that most people come to the meetings in person, but there have been times when people have had to travel because of family or have had a cold and didn't want to spread it. And so yesterday, for example, we had our weekly meeting and 3 or 4 people had the flu. And so they actually Zoomed in, and the rest of us were in the meeting room. In terms of the committees, and I'm saying this as, reflecting on what Deborah did and what I'm doing this year. You could have a 4-person next year who might have a different thought about this, but the committee meetings really are what we're finding, that the jurors elect to meet in person at the Civic Center. But if they wanted to hold meetings remotely, they could certainly do that. Anything else? Any other questions here? Let's see.
May I ask a question? Both of you have, in my humble opinion, very unique experience in that you've served in a variety of capacities in the last few years on the grand jury. What surprised you, if anything, as you reflect on it?
I'll let you take that one first, Deborah.
The surprise was that how entirely different the 2 grand juries were. As we tried to make clear in the presentation, a grand jury term is generally 1 year. In Marin, there'll be a few people who will continue on the second year and it's primarily administrative continuity. And the foreperson is usually one of those people. So Pat and I are both here as persons, and that means that we both got to do 2 years. And it's an entirely different experience. You may as well have a different name. Other than the fact that you go to the same room in the same building and you've got the same digital and equipment, it's an entirely different experience with a different group of people. And that's one of the things that makes it so unique. You just don't know what you're going to get, but they were both just as rewarding, just as interesting and enjoyable, just an entirely different soup of people.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And I think also, so it's one of the challenges is that because the groups change, that every year there's that ramp up period that we're, learning what to do, what the parameters are, what you can't do, the technology, and all of that. And sometimes people come, and as Deborah said, there are some things that it's very clear that we have to do and that we can't do or that we should do. But then there are other things that you just learn as you go, and they're like questions that hadn't come up in, my jury lifetime or Deborah's jury lifetime. And so you have to be able to deal with not having a, concrete rule book. That's not to say that you don't get plenty of training from the state of California as well as local training, but you have to be able to really, I guess, feel comfortable with some ambiguity, and some people have trouble with that. But it's like, it's like your family at the end, and you love them. Let's see. There's a question here about confidentiality a little bit more. So confidentiality is, and this is something that's sometimes hard for people to fully grasp, harder for some, kind of depends on what your background was and your maybe work experiences, but confidentiality is everything. So for example, when we send out a letter inviting someone to an interview, the fact of the interview is confidential, let alone what gets shared during the interview. And so that's really hard. And all we can do is the best that we can do as the requesting body, but we also make it clear when we're inviting someone for an interview that they are to keep the interview, even not only the instance of the interview, but the nature of the interview and what's discussed in the interview as confidential. And if you have an opportunity to read any of the reports, you'll see that none of the information is attributed to anyone interviewee, or that's confidential. And I think that's really important, because when people come and talk to us, they know that they're not going to be like outed, in the report, that there's a confidence there that we will keep what they tell us as confidential. And because everything needs to be backed up with others, what one person tells us is not going to be what's written in the report. We have to substantiate what that person is sharing with us with others. So it does help kind of diffuse where the source of the information could have come from. Do you have anything
Let
more?
me just add, the confidential mandate is very broad. So you are not allowed to disclose the topics that you're talking about in the grand jury to anyone outside of the grand jury. So your spouse, your family, a friend. At the end of the term, the only thing you can ever talk about is what's in the published reports. So my husband now can know that I spent a year investigating the Marin Municipal Water District. But for that entire year, he couldn't know that I was remotely interested in Marin Municipal Water District or anything else. So it's a very broad confidentiality. And the public information, so now he knows that's the topic, but I still can't ever share any of the conversations or discussions that we had. And as Pat pointed out, I really can't ever share where we got that information from, who told us things, is never disclosed. There's a question, how much information about the jurors is made public? There's a photo with our names on the website, and I think the website also lists the towns that we live in, and gives a generic age range for the jury as a whole. It's who we are is not confidential, we're public, but we also want to be able to go about our work without being, when we're walking in somewhere, people don't necessarily want to be able to say, oh, look, here comes the grand jury to come and talk to this person or that person.
Any other questions? Did I miss any? I think I got them all.
Thanks so much for letting us join us and talk about it. We're pretty excited about this work, and it's a lot of work and it's exhausting. And I've been emeritus now for 6 months, and it's still exciting for me to talk about.
Thank you. Thank you, Denise.
May I offer a warm thank you to both of you for coming and telling the rest of the community about what you do. Your generosity of time and spirit is much appreciated. If it's possible in the future for the law library to be a host for any activities where you have an outreach to the community to talk more about what you're doing, I believe we'd be delighted to be part of that. And we very, very much appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone be safe getting home if you're not at home, and join us next month. We're actually going to have a couple of representatives talking about high cap counseling here in the county. For those of you that may not be aware, Medicare counseling is actually handled by a group in Petaluma that reach out to no less than 6 communities and counties here in Northern California. So if you have questions for yourself or anyone you know about making Medicare choices, please join us next month. Thank you and have a lovely evening.